Okay, let's go ahead and continue with Hegel. So we have this situation where we are thinking about self-consciousness. And when you think about anything, you want to begin with its simplest form, right? You don't want to start with a more complex form. Like if you're doing chemistry, you don't want to begin studying chemistry by looking at methane or something of that sort. You want to look at the simplest elements, and then you want to break those apart into at least protons, neutrons, and electrons, correct? Okay, so likewise with self-consciousness. Self-consciousness does not have a chemical structure, but it has its own structure. And we want to look at the simplest manifestation of self-consciousness. That's desire, right? And we've seen that desire is understood as a kind of dissatisfaction, which has embedded within it the projection of a future satisfaction via an action taken on an object. Okay, that's very important. Now, I want to emphasize something here. What we're talking about is, I said it before, I'll say it again. We're talking about an agent, right, who has become wholly identified with his activity of desiring, as he lacks a set of moral principles which would have been inculcated in him through having been habituated into a culture. Right? Why are we making this assumption that morality is absent in that respect? Because we want to think about what desire looks like in its purity. Right? We're engaged in an analytical exercise. We want to understand desire as desire, not desire in relation to reason, right? You understand? Desire is desire. How would that look by itself? Okay. So we concluded that, make a long story short, right? Desire is an activity whereby an agent determines an object to be satisfying for himself, right? And that means he determines there to be a value in the world. Get that? And the value is something which is a value for him. So he's determining himself, right, to be a being for whom another object exists. You get that? He now is defined as a being who, for whom, right, something is at stake in the world, for whom there is something that is good, right? Which good thing serves as an aim, which as such justifies his taking action to appropriate that good thing. We also concluded that with respect to this good thing, he determines himself to have an unlimited right over that thing. So this activity of desiring is an activity of self-determination. The desiring agent determines himself to have an unlimited right and to stand in relation to an object with effectively an unlimited or absolute value. You get that? And that's on account of the structure of the activity of desiring itself. All right. The mirror analogy that we talked about in the previous lecture is helpful, but is of limited use. It almost sounds like the object itself is doing the activity of articulating the self. The object is playing a role. It's the self, the agent prior to being a self, right? The agent prior to being a self that determines the object to have a certain value, and through the object, through that relation to the object, determines itself to have a right. This might be a little bit easier to approach if we do imagine how things look once one understands moral duties and moral rights. So normally when you relate to another person, like if you were to go back to a classroom and see CRI, if ever they open it up again for general business, and you were to sit next to someone and they had their mobile phone out and they were using it, you know immediately that in virtue of your relation to that person, insofar as that's a person that you're relating to, you have a duty, an obligation not to appropriate that phone and say, oh, that's a nice phone, I'll take that, thank you so much, that's great, thank you. Or I guess if you were that sort, you wouldn't say thank you, you just take it. When you relate to a person, you become conscious of your duty not to do something. You follow? So primitive desire, by analogy, when it relates to a thing, determines a consciousness of a right to take the thing, indeed to destroy it, right? Because we saw that with desire as such, necessarily, we had an argument to that effect. You might want to revisit that. Desire as such determines itself to be possessed, pardon me, in possession of an unlimited right. An unlimited right. Okay, so that is why self-consciousness is relational. This is how we begin to witness the entry of a kind of moral vocabulary, right? Of course, on ethics, so we're interested in this question, how this moral vocabulary of rights, and eventually we'll get duties. They aren't there yet. Rights, duties, and values enters in. You might say, well, why isn't there any duty at this point, right? Well, it's there implicitly. It's there as a possibility, because as soon as we limit an entity's right, that is to establish a duty, right? Correct? When your right is limited, what limits a right? A duty limits a right. If a duty not to do something means that you don't have a right to do that thing. Therefore, your general right to act is limited. Another aspect of this is that there's no language here, right? I mean, it's not like the person is asserting his right claim. Rather, the right claim is asserted through the action. So it's in and through an action that the desiring agent, who is, as it were, identified with desire because he's completely possessed by his desires, it's in and through an action that the desiring agent asserts a claim to moral status vis-a-vis the object. I'll say it again. It is in and through an action that the moral agent makes a claim, right? Not in language, to being an entity with moral status vis-a-vis an object. And he does this over and over again, so he's always asserting the same moral status, by the way, unlimited moral status, as if he, the human beings by nature assert themselves to have, the power of the emperor of China, right? Until they're told otherwise with spankings and nursery rhymes and however we get kids to toe the line. Okay, so we'll skip this first little bit here, which just reviews the problems with the self-identification model of self-consciousness. We saw that it was no good, right? So we concluded that one cannot identify oneself, right? So self-consciousness can't be an immediate self-relation. It has to go through an object. Okay, so I think we have enough about that. If self-consciousness cannot be based on an immediate self-relation, then it must be based on a mediated self-relation. Okay, and this takes the form of the self first coming to be at all in and through relation to other beings. Okay, so I hope that's becoming clearer as we say it over and over again. If you read the first couple of paragraphs of the reading from the Phenomenology of Spirit, chapter 4, that's what he's talking about there. Okay, I think you'll see it too. I went through it very carefully with one class. I approached this a bit differently. I just read it to them, and that's what he's talking about. Okay? Desire is the most basic cognitive form through which human beings relate to objects and can mediate their self-relation. Okay, that should be clear by now. Desire is cognitive. Why is it cognitive? Because it involves prejudgmental categorical determinations. Prejudgmental. So this is prior to intellectual judgment, but there are categories here. This is interesting, right? Of dissatisfaction, satisfaction, and the object. And these can be true or false. These categorical determinations can be true or false. What's cognitive? Whatever's cognitive has to do with what can be true or false. For example, if a determination implies a contradiction, then it is false. By the way, that's part of Hegel's method. He'll show that a contradiction will creep in, and that'll refute the claim to having an unlimited right over all things. That's his basic strategy, to show that that implies a contradiction. So then one is, strictly speaking, obligated to limit one's right. So when relating to an object, the desiring agent determines itself through the object to have an unlimited right over the latter, and it determines the object to be an absolute good. Okay, I think that's stated enough. Right? If you're still puzzling over that, go back to the beginning of the lecture and play the first 5 minutes, right? Let's move on. So the self emerges through a self-constituting act that involves the consciousness of a norm and of a value. So a norm is like a rule which either binds you, or in this case, an unlimited right unleashes you to do what you please, right? And then there's a value. What's a value? Value establishes an aim. Right? And generally speaking, a value is something you want to realize. So a self is essentially aware of itself in and through its awareness of a right or a duty, and of values that matter for the self, okay? All right. Some of you are saying, okay, with the self is determining the values, this sounds like relativism or something, that whatever the self of the opinion is good is good. No, because, again, certain ways of valuing imply contradictions. Get that? So we have to work out the pattern of the relationship between the desiring self and objects such that we get rid of contradictions. There has to be kind of coherence that emerges eventually. And that's going to impose a certain kind of form on valuation. There are objective values for Hegel. There are objective values. It has to do with the logic of the relationship between the agent and between the objects and the persons with whom he interacts. You'll appreciate that more and more when we get into the next book. This is just the foundation. So the form of self-consciousness is pre-reflective. Pre-reflective. It's not a matter of reflective reason. In philosophy, generally in the university, when we talk about reflection, we're talking about using your intellect to reflect on something, to think about something, think it over, analyze it, compare it to other things, draw conclusions concerning it. So this form of self-consciousness, and it is a form of self-consciousness, right? Because in acting on the object, you're acting on the object in such a way that the agent is determining itself to have a right and determining itself to relate to the object so that the latter has a value for it, for that agent, right? So it is is a pragmatic self-consciousness, right? Self-consciousness embedded in action. This form of self-consciousness is, for that reason, pre-reflective. Desiderative self-consciousness in its primitive and pure form. It does not involve reflective thought at all. And its meaning is wholly absorbed in and expressed through action. Okay? Aren't actions meaningful? You read people's body language all the time. And you take their body language to mean things. Body language is meaningful. People make assertions by using their bodies, yeah? So if you're talking to somebody, the person slumps his shoulders, starts looking off to the side. He doesn't want to be there, right? Like maybe he doesn't want to hear what you have to say. Like you say, Trump stole the election. Not Trump, Biden. Biden stole the election. He's a Biden supporter, or at least he hates Trump. So his shoulders slump. He looks away, right? With his body language, he's like, I really don't want to listen to this. Okay? Or someone says, Biden's just fantastic. I love him. And the other guy's shoulders slump. He's a Trump supporter. Okay. So actions themselves are meaningful. An agent expresses a take on his or her rights or duties and on what matters to him or her through action. We have an end there for some reason. Lovely thing is we can fix it. Okay, so I think we have the basic idea there, guys. So actions will remain meaningful, right? Once we take a desiring agent and we shape him in a home, in a village, in a town, right? In a state, in a country, we shape him up into a moral agent, an ethical agent. We'll talk about morality and ethicality. There's a difference between the two in Hegel. We shape him up into an ethical agent, right? The actions remain meaningful, right? The body language remains active, but body language, if you like, has its ground in desire. Make any sense? Body language, the phenomenon of body language has its foundation in the activity of desiring. Because the activity of desiring itself motivates actions which are meaningful. Actions are straight away meaningful for human beings. In a way for animals too, right? So when one desire encounters another, what's the problem? If one desire asserting that it has an absolute right over the other desire, but the other one asserts the exact same thing. So you have two desires asserting an absolute right over one another. What's the result, guys? That's the result right there, violence, right? Okay, let's consider two possibilities. First, one desire takes the other desire. Call one Alfred, and call the second one Bartholomew. So Alfred, right, takes Bartholomew as an object, and he attempts immediate violence upon him. Remember, his right is to negate the object. So he's going to kill the guy. Right to negate of which desires the essential actualization. what does that mean? I mean, desire is the actualization of the claim of a right to negate. Until desire gets educated, right? Once we educate desire, then there's no longer a right to negate. By the way, I mentioned shopaholic. How do shopaholics actually behave? I mean, they buy this stuff and they don't even use it. It just keeps piling up. They don't so much use things or even store things, they consume things. Right? That's consumption, that's negation. What does consumerism? Consumerism follows naturally from this analysis of desire. That's why this analysis is hopeful. You can explain romantic infatuation pretty decently with this. You can explain consumerism and various the kind of aim of advertising and marketing, with this analysis. But if you can get a lot of human experience, preferably all of it, right, under the tent of this analysis, then that counts in favor of the analysis. So the second point, one desire cognizes another desire exercising its right over a third object. So one desire is reaching for a pear, but the first desire, seeing the other desire reach for a pear, experiences that as a challenge, right? As the first desire holds that its right over an object is unlimited. Sorry, first and second got reversed in how I was extemporizing and how this is written down. So there's a first desire that sees a second desire reach for a pear, right? As the first desire holds that its right over an object is unlimited, it imitates the second desire because it can't allow that the second desire exercise a right over that pear. That would limit its own right. Follow? This is correct. We're getting not only an explanation of possibly of romantic infatuation and of how advertising works, but also of this certain kind of spontaneity with which violence crops up between human beings. Okay, so it attempts to appropriate and destroy the very same particular object, and they end up struggling over it, right? That's the struggle for. It turns into the struggle for recognition. But a few of you responded to that. I look forward to reading what you have to say about it. So this is the point at which the Hegelian theory of desire becomes. Now I'm going to introduce a concept here from another thinker, a guy named René Girard. Okay, René Girard. So I haven't mentioned him yet, but actually I have mentioned him, but I haven't got into him. So René Girard has this idea of mimetic acquisition. I'm just throwing this in there. Why? Because I think it's true. That's why I want you to know it's true. I have an obligation to teach you philosophical theories that I believe might have some actual merit. Now you analyze them. You decide whether they do have that merit. I can't do that part for you, but I can introduce you to this stuff. So this is the point at which the Hegelian theory of desire becomes mimetic acquisition. Right? So one individual tries to take something, the second individual can't endure the spectacle of that first individual. It's a violation of his absolute right, so he attacks him. Well, let me just take it a step back. What he does is he conceives a desire for the very same object, and then that becomes a fight, right? All right, there we go. And I say, if you read René Girard, you'll learn a lot. I can recommend, for a general overview, he has a book called Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. It kind of gives you the whole thing in one book. The classic study, however, is Violence and the Sacred. Violence and the Sacred. Okay. Now he does have a kind of original book. Now, what was the name of the thing? I think it's oh my goodness. I think it's called Mimetic Desire. That's what it's called. This is his original literary theory. He was developing a theory of the novel, and then he noticed that he discovered something while developing a theory of the novel, and so he shifted his principles over to the case of religion. He discovered, wow, I'm explaining everything in the history of religion too. So if his theory works the way he says it works, Girard actually explains the history of literature, not just a novel, because he talks about myth and tragedy and things of that sort. He would explain the history of literature and the history of religion. Now, if you have one principle from which you can derive two different departments of human existence and shed incredible light on both, and that counts in favor of your theory. So that's just a vote in favor of Girard and encouraging you to look him up. Back to Hegel. If we imagine a group of humans numbering, say, 10 or more, let's continue with this thought. The violence itself can spread until the annihilation of the group, or several members enter into solidarity against one. Okay? That latter becomes a scapegoat. I mean, this is, I'm continuing with Girard just because it's so interesting. You guys follow? Violence itself can spread until the annihilation of the group. You follow? Because they're all imitating one another in their acquisitive action. So they struggle with one another and eventually they wipe one another out. I mean, there's one guy left standing at the end, and then you don't have a group any longer. There's an alternative to that. That's the alternative of several members entering into solidarity against one. They can all agree that he's the culprit and he's the one who's violating their right. Now they have to have a conception of a collective right? Then they can take care of him and experience a collective satisfaction in having done him in. Witness the origin of human sacrifice. Okay? So that latter guy becomes a scapegoat. His murder satisfies the group. It's like a group satisfaction. They experience it in and through one another. They recognize one another as part of the group. And they consolidate around a group identity defined in relation to the scapegoat. The group self-consciousness itself assumes the form of a return to self through the other. In this case, the scapegoat who has been killed. Because that's interesting. That's a little bit of a side bar, but is a fascinating one. So in this case, a small political society is born. And then religious ritual is likewise born as a ritual imitation of the founding act of murder. Okay? I'll leave it at that. You guys can follow up on that with Girard. So violence forces desire to defend itself. You have desire against desire, right? It excites the activity, therefore, of anger. So anger emerges out of desire. So desire is a kind of assertion of an absolute right. Anger is the modification desire undergoes when that right is challenged. So it's like a meta-desire of sorts. But it's a distinct emotion, no doubt. It's a distinct emotion. There's a state of, let's say, equilibrium that's disrupted by a challenge to the claim that desire makes, right? I have an absolute right to this pear. Someone else reaches for the pear. Okay, he's challenged my right claim. How do I respond to that? Do I just say, okay, you can have, if I'm like, this miniature emperor of China, I'm not going to take it. And so what happens in self-consciousness is the emergence of the emotion of anger. I say emotion now emerges, right? Because anger is an emotion, desire is just desire. They're both passions, right? Both passions. Passion splits into desire on the one hand and the emotions on the other. There's a whole pile of emotions. And so now anger emerges as a kind of a doubled back assertion, a kind of primitively reflective assertion. That's not intellectually reflective, but a kind of, I'll explain this, a kind of reflective assertion of the truth of the claim to an unlimited right to all things, and to that pair particularly. But why do I say reflective? Because when one desire faces the other, they start struggling, they start fighting, right? So you have one desire here. What's his name? Alfred versus Bartholomew. And when Alfred struggles with Bartholomew, he has to keep track of what Bartholomew is intending to do to Alfred, otherwise there's no fight. So Alfred is keeping track of Bartholomew, thinking about Alfred. So again, Alfred is keeping track, he's conscious of Bartholomew, thinking about or being conscious of Alfred. So Alfred is conscious of himself now through Bartholomew. Do you get that? He has a mediated consciousness of himself. So Alfred now has achieved this, guys. He's achieved reflective self-consciousness. And anger is the first glimmer of reflective self-consciousness. So Alfred struggles with Bartholomew, right? He's aware that Bartholomew is challenging his right claim, because that's the meaning of Bartholomew's acts. And he's able to get that. You've got to build into these guys an ability to recognize challenges to their own right claims and to respond appropriately. And that appropriate response is anger. And anger expresses itself in violent actions, the attempt to slug the other guy down. Right? Okay. So this is why we say this gives birth to reflective awareness of the self tracking the violent other planning out one's own destruction. So hopefully that's clear by now. It further shifts the focus from objects to recognition. This is why Hegel talks about the desire for recognition, right? So now the issue has shifted, right? And it shifts with the necessity. I mean, the issue originally was the object, but the object is just an occasion for moving on to the real issue. You know, one person reached for the object. Well, that was just the occasion for the other person experiencing a challenge to his right claim. Okay, now the object is something that's experienced as an absolute value, so the object is of importance, indeed, a kind of absolute importance. But in the struggle comes to shift, right? To be about the right claim of each. Now, once one guy slugs the other one, he can go back to the object, pick it up, and eat it, whatever he likes. But while they're struggling, the real issue here is the question of whose supreme right will be, or whose unlimited right will be recognized. And each individual wants that recognition. You follow? Because a few different things could happen. They could fight to a draw, in which case neither gets any recognition. That's what happens between Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the Enema Elish, which you should read. Right? Or one guy could kill the other. But it's possible that a guy who doesn't have a justified right to dominate the other and to basically own all things and dominate all things, it's possible the guy who lacks that right could accidentally kill the other, right? That's why we have to consider the third possibility. It's only the third possibility that is really satisfying, and that's when one individual subordinates himself to the other. He submits and calls himself the slave of the other. Effectively, he recognizes the other's authority. Right? That's what that means. Okay. So that's why I say the issue is now only secondarily the object. We have an extra word here, over which desire expresses a right of annihilation. The primary issue is to compel the other to recognize as supreme. Okay. Once that's done, he can go back to consuming the things he regards as absolutely good. That doesn't disappear forever. Even if successful, the result is incoherent. Okay, this is one of Hegel's brilliant insights. Let's say the victor compels the recognition of the slave. What happens then? Then the recognition of the latter is worthless, isn't it? I mean, if you compel the recognition of someone who you reduce to a zero status entity, remember that little possibility that's lodged in being an agent, of being an individual without any moral status at all? Because desiring is the activity of establishing one's moral status vis-a-vis an object. Well, you just might fail at that because somebody can challenge your claim to that object and then knock you cold. And make it terrified and subordinate yourself to him. You have the authority, I have nothing. That person's a zero status entity. That's what we call a slave, right? So, say if the victor compels the recognition of the slave, well, the slave is a zero status entity. He has no value at all. What are the value of his judgments? He can't have any value. I mean, if his judgments have value, then he himself would have value as a being who could produce valuable judgments. You follow? As a being who could generate truth, which one or the other is an intrinsic value, right? So if the victor, the master, the one who becomes the master, if he forces this recognition, he can't enjoy the recognition because it's coming from somebody who's a nobody, put it frankly, plainly, or bluntly. So the alternative is to recognize the slave. If he recognizes the slave, what does it mean to recognize the slave? It means to acknowledge that the slave has a right. If he acknowledges the slave has a right, that right limits his own unlimited right, and he gives up the unlimited right. He limits his own right. So recognition limits the right of the slave. I'm sorry, recognition limits the right of the master. Okay? And so he loses that absolute right, and that's the end of that. Now, it's interesting. How does this eventuality occur? Loss in the struggle occurs on account of fear, right? So here we encounter another emotion emerging here. Hegel's careful to note when these new modifications of self-consciousness creep in. So this is the second emotion to emerge in the scheme. So this reflection on self-consciousness has thus revealed a primitive link between desire, anger, and fear. That's very interesting. All right. So let me take this a step further. What happens to the slave? Add this here. Let me do this over here. Fit this in the right spot. Is that going to work? It returns and doing it. No, I'm so certain it's going to work. Well, okay, so the slave is placed under the authority of the master. What's his life look like now? He is now under an absolute duty to obey the master. The master just has an unlimited right. But guess what? If you look at this from the standpoint of the theory of self-consciousness, or the history of self-consciousness, the slave becomes deeper. The slave has a duty he has to obey. Because he has a duty he has to obey, the slave develops genuinely moral self-consciousness, right? He can't just do whatever he wants. He has to structure his actions in accordance with duty. That makes him a moral agent. So moral agency is emerging here, right? We can just add here.
We found something that I thought.
Just pause for a second, please. I'm recording. Folks, I'm sorry. Sometimes people just choose to walk into my room. I guess they weren't aware of what I was doing. That's I can't blame them. Okay, so since the slave must obey the master, he lives in accordance with the duty, the presence of which is his self-consciousness. Now, well, how was I going to finish that? Okay. Makes him a moral agent. Okay. Further, he develops moral habits of self-control. Oh my goodness. That is, he develops virtue. Okay. Boy, I wish this thing worked better. So virtue, I mean, that's that term we're familiar with from much of the course, entire course actually. That's that attribute of character that produces moral actions, right? Oh, I see what's going on here. We're missing a U. Get in there. Okay. So we have two ways in which the slave is making advances in his humanity. Okay, he's conscious of a moral duty. He's developing self-control. He's able to, as Hegel says, delay gratification. It's a third and decisive mode of advance that this person in the state of slave is enjoying. He does enjoy. The master does not. The slave is the guy who's working the earth. Maybe he's farming for the master, perhaps doing some basic carpentry, whatever he's doing. He's gradually shaping the world in accordance with his conception and imagination. That's interesting. The master's just kind of lazing about. You think that it's only a matter of time before this slave sneaks up on the master, does him in, but we're not interested in the novelistic aspects of this. We're interested in the logical implications of this relationship. And the logical implications are that we have moral self-consciousness, we develop virtue, and now that we have an individual who is shaping the world in accordance with his own conception and imagination. That is, he's making the world reflect himself. And if you make the world reflect yourself, you feel more at home at it. Well, it becomes a structural relation. You become at home, right? in relation to that which you have shaped. So it's just like decorating your room. Right? You fill it with the stuff that you like, and then you feel at home there. It doesn't matter of feeling, but you are at home there. I mean, so what Hegel would say, yeah, you feel at home there because of the deeper point. You are at home there. You get that? So that prose, okay. Unfortunately, let's see here. This seems to have frozen, so I can't seem to get it in there. Hopefully this will unfreeze, and then I will just post it, and you'll be able to get this last little bit here. But I've been waiting for a while; it hasn't worked yet. So that is Hegel's theory of self-consciousness at its root. Okay. Now, when we turn to the next book, The Philosophy of Right. Now, when you turn to that, I gave you a free version online towards the top of course content, and then I gave you the title of a better translation with the ISBN. If you can buy that, you'll have a much better translation to work with. If you can't afford it, then just work with the old translation. But that one has some mistakes. All right. So when we turn to the philosophy of right, notice there's that word right again. Okay. There we're going to locate self-consciousness in spirit. In spirit, that's going to be that typically Hegelian move. But to understand that, we have to talk about it. So I'm going to let you read that material, and then we'll talk about that next week. You will.